In a world where heroes are often celebrated with medals and monuments, some of the most extraordinary acts of courage happen in the shadows, performed by people whose names never make headlines. What happens when society's most overlooked profession becomes the last line of defense between life and death? When someone trained to heal must choose between safety and sacrifice? This is the story of Maria Santos, a night shift nurse whose quiet dedication would be tested in ways no medical school could have prepared her for. In the span of one terrifying evening, she would discover that sometimes the most ordinary people are called to do the most extraordinary things, and that true heroism doesn't wear a uniform, it wears scrubs. Maria Santos had always been invisible, not in the way that made her stand out, but in a way that made people look right through her, as if she were part of the hospital furniture. At 32 years old, she had spent nearly a decade working the night shift at St. Mary's Regional Medical Center, a sprawling facility that served the diverse neighborhoods of East Los Angeles. While other nurses complained about the graveyard hours, Maria found comfort in the quiet corridors and dimmed lights that marked the boundary between day and night. She was barely 5 feet tall, with gentle brown eyes that seemed too large for a round face. Her black hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her scrubs hung loose on her small frame. Maria spoke with a soft voice that carried the faintest trace of an accent from her childhood in El Salvador. Doctors often had to lean in to hear her during rounds, and some had grown impatient with her quiet manner of speaking. She had learned long ago that being loud didn't make you heard, so she chose her words carefully and spoke only when necessary. The hospital administration barely knew her name, despite her perfect attendance record and the fact that she had never missed a shift in 3 years. During staff meetings, she sat in the back row, taking notes while others spoke up about policy changes and budget cuts. When the head of nursing introduced new protocols, Maria would nod silently and implement every change without complaint. She was the kind of employee who made the system work smoothly, the kind that supervisors took for granted because she never caused problems. Her colleagues respected her work, but rarely included her in their conversations. During break times, while other nurses gathered around the vending machines to share stories about their weekend plans or complain about difficult patients, Maria would sit alone in the small staff kitchen, quietly eating her homemade lunch and reading medical journals on her phone. She preferred learning about new treatments and techniques rather than gossiping about hospital politics. The patients, however, saw her differently. Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who had been admitted for pneumonia, always smiled when Maria entered her room. Maria would check her vitals with gentle hands and adjust her pillows without being asked. She remembered that Mrs. Chun liked her water at room temperature and that she worried about her cat at home. When Mrs. Chun couldn't sleep, Maria would sit beside her bed for a few extra minutes, speaking softly about anything except illness and medicine. Down the hall, 12-year-old Tommy Rodriguez looked forward to Maria's rounds. He had been in and out of the hospital for months while doctors tried to manage his diabetes. Most of the medical staff spoke to his parents about his condition, but Maria always talked directly to Tommy. She explained what each medication would do and why the blood tests were necessary. She brought him crossword puzzles from the newspaper and celebrated with him when his glucose levels improved. Maria's approach to nursing went beyond following doctors' orders and checking boxes on charts. She noticed things that others missed. She saw how Mr. Johnson's hands trembled slightly when his daughter visited, suggesting his anxiety medication needed adjustment. She observed that Mrs. Garcia ate better when her meals were served exactly at 6:30, not the usual 7 o'clock. These small details mattered to her because she understood that healing involved more than just medicine. Her apartment was a 15-minute drive from the hospital, in a modest complex where she had lived alone for the past 5 years. The one-bedroom unit was decorated simply, with a few plants on the windowsill and family photos arranged carefully on a small bookshelf. Most of the photos showed her with her younger sister Elena and Elena's 2 children, who lived across town. Maria visited them every Sunday afternoon, bringing groceries and helping with homework. She was a reliable aunt who never forgot birthdays and always had Band-Aids in her purse. Elena often worried about her sister's solitary lifestyle. "You work too much, Maria," she would say during the weekly phone calls. "You need to meet someone, go out more, have some fun." But Maria found purpose in her work that filled the spaces where others might feel loneliness. She knew that when she clocked in each night at 11 o'clock, she was becoming part of something larger than herself. The night shift brought its own rhythm and challenges. Emergency room admissions slowed down after midnight, but the intensive care unit never truly rested. Maria worked primarily on the medical surgical floor, caring for patients recovering from operations or managing chronic conditions. She had become skilled at reading the subtle signs that indicated when someone's condition was changing. A slight change in breathing pattern, an unusual restlessness, or a barely perceptible shift in skin color could signal the need for immediate intervention. Dr. Peterson, one of the senior physicians, had begun to rely on Maria's observations more than he cared to admit. She had a gift for sensing when patients were struggling, even when their vital signs appeared stable. Last month, she had quietly suggested that he check on Mr. Williams in room 314, mentioning that something about his demeanor seemed different. Dr. Peterson had initially dismissed her concern, but decided to examine the patient anyway. They discovered internal bleeding that could have been fatal if left undetected for a few more hours. Despite her competence, Maria rarely received recognition for her contributions. During the annual staff appreciation ceremony, she watched from the audience as other nurses received awards for outstanding service and patient advocacy. She applauded genuinely for her colleagues, feeling proud of their achievements without resentment about being overlooked. Maria measured her success differently than others. Her reward came from seeing patients recover and knowing that she had played a part in their healing process. The hospital had undergone several changes in recent years. Budget constraints had led to staff reductions, and the remaining nurses often felt overwhelmed by increased patient loads. Mandatory overtime had become common, and tensions ran high during shift changes. Some of Maria's colleagues had transferred to other facilities or left nursing altogether. Through it all, Maria remained steady and reliable, adapting to new challenges without complaint. She had developed a reputation among security guards and maintenance staff as someone who treated everyone with the same quiet respect. James, the night security supervisor, always made sure to check on her during his rounds. "You're here late again, Maria," he would say, noting that she often stayed past her scheduled shift to ensure proper handoff to the morning nurses. "Don't forget to take care of yourself, too." Maria would smile and assure him that she was fine, though she rarely left the hospital before 8 in the morning. Her dedication extended beyond her assigned duties. When the hospital charity fund needed volunteers to organize donations for families who couldn't afford treatment, Maria quietly contributed both time and money. She sorted clothes and assembled care packages without seeking recognition or praise. Her name never appeared in the volunteer newsletters, but several families benefited from her anonymous generosity. Maria had chosen nursing because she wanted to make a difference, even if that difference was measured in small moments rather than grand gestures. She found meaning in adjusting a pillow for a restless patient, in explaining a procedure to ease someone's anxiety, or in simply being present during difficult times. She understood that healing required both medical expertise and human compassion, and she strived to provide both with equal dedication. As summer turned to fall, Maria noticed an increase in tension throughout the hospital. There had been reports of gang-related violence in the surrounding neighborhoods, and security had been heightened accordingly. Additional cameras were installed in parking areas, and staff were advised to travel in groups when leaving the building late at night. These precautions felt abstract to Maria, who had always felt safe within the hospital's walls. The medical community had become increasingly concerned about workplace violence against healthcare workers. National statistics showed rising incidents of threats and assaults on medical staff, particularly in urban hospitals. St. Mary's had implemented new protocols for dealing with agitated patients and visitors, including panic buttons in patient rooms and improved communication with local law enforcement. Maria had attended the mandatory safety training sessions, but found it difficult to reconcile the discussions about potential violence with her daily experience of caring for people in their most vulnerable moments. She believed in the fundamental goodness of human nature and trusted that her commitment to helping others would protect her from harm. This faith in humanity had guided her throughout her nursing career and shaped her approach to patient care. Her supervisor, Janet Walsh, had begun to notice Maria's consistent performance and was considering recommending her for additional training opportunities. Janet had observed how other nurses sought Maria's advice when dealing with difficult situations, despite Maria's reluctance to position herself as a leader. She has natural instincts that can't be taught, Janet had mentioned to the department head during their monthly review meeting. As October arrived, Maria settled into what seemed like another routine month of night shifts. She had no way of knowing that everything she had learned about courage, compassion, and human nature would soon be tested in ways that would change not only her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. The quiet nurse who had spent years being overlooked was about to become the center of a story that would remind everyone why healthcare workers deserve recognition, not just for their medical skills, but for their extraordinary capacity to remain human in the face of inhumane circumstances. The night of October 15 started like any other Tuesday evening at St. Mary's Regional Medical Center. Maria clocked in at exactly 11 o'clock, exchanging brief pleasantries with the day shift nurses as they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. The hospital felt calm, with most patients settled in for the night, and the usual collection of chronic conditions and post-surgical recoveries filling the medical surgical floor where Maria worked. During her initial rounds, Maria checked on Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman recovering from hip replacement surgery. Mrs. Patterson had been having trouble sleeping since her operation 3 days earlier, and Maria spent extra time adjusting her position and ensuring her pain medication was managing her discomfort effectively. In room 302, she found Mr. Valdez awake and anxious about his upcoming cardiac procedure scheduled for the morning. Maria sat with him for several minutes, explaining the routine nature of the surgery and reminding him that Dr. Kim had performed hundreds of similar operations successfully. The emergency department had been relatively quiet throughout the evening, with only a few minor injuries and routine admissions. Dr. Martinez was covering the night shift in the ER, and he had mentioned to Maria earlier that it seemed like it might be one of those rare, peaceful nights where everyone could catch up on paperwork and documentation. The hospital's rhythm felt steady and predictable, exactly the way Maria preferred it. Around 1:30 in the morning, Maria was updating patient charts at the nurse's station when she heard the distant sound of sirens approaching the hospital. Emergency vehicles arrived frequently at St. Mary's, so the sound didn't immediately alarm her. She continued her documentation, noting that Mr. Thompson in room 318 would need his dressing changed in the morning and that Mrs. Rodriguez had requested an additional blanket. The first indication that something unusual was happening came when Dr. Martinez's voice crackled over the hospital's communication system, requesting additional staff to the emergency department immediately. His tone carried an urgency that made Maria look up from her computer. Within minutes, several off-duty doctors and nurses began arriving at the hospital, called in to assist with what was being described as a mass casualty incident. Maria learned from James, the security supervisor, that there had been a shooting at a community center about 6 blocks from the hospital. Early reports indicated multiple victims, and emergency medical services were transporting the injured to St. Mary's as the closest trauma facility. The community center had been hosting a youth basketball game when the violence erupted, meaning that many of the victims were teenagers and young adults. As ambulances began arriving in rapid succession, the hospital's emergency protocols activated automatically. The incident command system designated specific roles for all available personnel, and Maria found herself reassigned from her regular floor duties to assist in the emergency department. She had trained for mass casualty situations during her nursing education, but this was the first time she would experience the reality of treating multiple victims of violence. The emergency department transformed into controlled chaos within minutes. Trauma bays filled with victims suffering from gunshot wounds ranging from minor to critical. Maria was assigned to assist Dr. Sarah Kim, a trauma surgeon who was treating a 17-year-old named David who had been shot in the shoulder. David was conscious, but terrified, calling out for his mother and asking repeatedly if he was going to die. Maria focused on keeping David calm, while Dr. Kim assessed his injuries and prepared him for emergency surgery. She explained each step of the treatment process, reassuring him that his wound, while serious, was not life-threatening if properly treated. She held his hand while the medical team started in 4-line and administered pain medication. Her gentle voice and steady presence helped David relax enough for the medical team to work effectively. In the next trauma bay, a 12-year-old girl named Sophia was being treated for a graze wound to her leg. Sophia was crying for her father, who had also been injured in the shooting and was being treated in a different part of the hospital. Maria stepped in to comfort Sophia when she heard the child's distressed cries. She found coloring books and crayons from the pediatric supply room and sat with Sophia, helping her color pictures of flowers while the medical team cleaned and bandaged her wound. The hospital corridors filled with families desperately seeking information about their loved ones. Parents who had dropped their children off at the basketball game arrived in various states of panic and grief. Maria observed the family liaisons struggling to provide updates while maintaining patient confidentiality and managing the emotional chaos that accompanies such tragic events. As the night progressed, Maria moved between different areas of the emergency department, providing support wherever it was most needed. She helped translate for Spanish-speaking families who were struggling to communicate with medical staff. She located personal belongings that had been separated from patients during the initial triage process. She assisted with documentation and ensured that critical supplies remained stocked as the medical teams worked to save lives. Dr. Martinez later described Maria's performance that night as exceptional. She seemed to know exactly where she was needed at any given moment, he would tell administrators during the incident review meeting. While everyone else was focused on the immediate medical needs, Maria was paying attention to the human elements that are just as important during a crisis. Around 4 a.m, as the immediate medical emergencies were stabilized and some patients were being transferred to surgery or admitted to the hospital, a new crisis began to unfold. Intelligence from law enforcement indicated that the shooting at the community center might not have been an isolated incident. There were reports of additional violence planned at locations where victims' families might gather, and hospitals were being identified as potential targets. Hospital security increased their presence throughout the facility, and all entrances except the main emergency department entrance were secured and monitored. Staff members were advised to remain alert for any suspicious activity or individuals who might not have legitimate business at the hospital. Despite these precautions, the focus remained on providing medical care to the victims and support to their families. Maria was helping to transfer David, the 17-year-old shooting victim, to the operating room when she noticed 3 men entering the emergency department who didn't appear to be family members or patients seeking treatment. Unlike the worried relatives who had been arriving throughout the night, these men seemed calm and purposeful in their movements. They wore similar dark clothing and kept their hands in their jacket pockets as they surveyed the busy emergency department. Something about their demeanor triggered an instinct that Maria had developed over years of observing people in crisis. Families in distress moved differently than these men. They showed emotion, asked questions, and focused on finding their loved ones. These three men were scanning the environment methodically, as if they were looking for specific targets rather than specific people. Maria quietly alerted James, the security supervisor, about her concerns. James immediately began moving through the emergency department, positioning himself to better observe the three men while maintaining communication with his security team. The hospital's protocol required that any suspicious individuals be monitored discreetly while avoiding actions that might escalate a potentially dangerous situation. The men began moving deeper into the emergency department, past the reception area where families were gathered waiting for news about their loved ones. One of them approached a group of teenagers who were huddled together near the waiting room, apparently friends of some of the shooting victims. Maria recognized the body language of predators, identifying vulnerable targets, and she realized that the violence from earlier in the evening was not over. Dr. Kim emerged from Trauma Bay 3 just as Maria was completing David's transfer preparation. Maria quickly briefed her on the suspicious individuals, and Dr. Kim immediately contacted hospital security while beginning to implement lockdown procedures for the emergency department. The goal was to protect patients, families, and staff without creating panic that could worsen an already tense situation. As hospital security began responding to the threat, one of the three men noticed the increased attention and made eye contact with his companions. In that moment, Maria understood that they had been discovered and that whatever they had planned was about to happen immediately. The next few hours would test every principle she had learned about nursing, every instinct she had developed about protecting others, and every belief she held about the capacity for good to triumph over evil. The emergency department, already strained by treating multiple trauma victims, was about to become the scene of an even more serious crisis. Maria found herself in a position where her years of quiet service and overlooked contributions would suddenly become the foundation for actions that could save or cost multiple lives. The invisible nurse was about to step into a spotlight she had never sought, in circumstances she could never have imagined. The transformation happened in seconds. One moment, Maria was preparing to will David to surgery while keeping an eye on the three suspicious men, and the next moment, the emergency department erupted into a nightmare that would test every principle she had learned about preserving life and protecting others. The man nearest to the group of teenagers suddenly pulled a weapon from his jacket, and his two companions followed suit. Their plan became terrifyingly clear as they began shouting orders for everyone to get on the ground. They weren't random criminals seeking valuables. They were there to finish what had been started at the community center, to eliminate witnesses and send a message that would terrorize the entire neighborhood. James, the security supervisor, immediately radioed for police backup while moving to position himself between the gunmen and the largest group of civilians. But he was vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Dr. Kim activated the hospital's emergency lockdown system, triggering alerts that would seal off sections of the hospital and notify law enforcement of an active shooter situation. Maria's first instinct was to protect David, who was still recovering from surgery and completely vulnerable on the transport gurney. She quickly moved him behind the nurse's station, using the solid desk as cover while trying to keep him calm despite his growing terror at the chaos erupting around them. "Stay quiet and stay low," she whispered to him, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The emergency department's layout worked against everyone's safety. The open design that facilitated efficient medical care now provided the gunmen with clear sight lines to potential targets. Families who had been waiting for news about their loved ones scrambled for cover behind chairs and desks that offered minimal protection. Medical staff tried to shield patients while looking for escape routes that didn't exist. Sophia, the 12-year-old girl with the leg wound, was trapped in Trauma Bay 2 with no immediate cover. Her eyes met Maria's across the chaotic room, and Maria saw the pure terror of a child who didn't understand why violence kept following her. Without conscious thought, Maria left David's side and moved towards Sophia, staying low and using medical equipment as cover. "We need to get everyone out of here," Dr. Kim said to Maria as she crouched behind an equipment cart. "Can you help move patients to the secure areas?" But they both knew that moving critically injured patients would be nearly impossible without exposing them to greater danger. One of the gunmen began moving toward the area where several families were huddled together, apparently targeting people who might be relatives of the original shooting victims. Maria realized that these weren't random attackers, but individuals with specific goals related to the earlier violence. They were trying to eliminate witnesses and intimidate a community into silence about whatever criminal activity had led to the original shooting. As the gunmen approached the terrified families, Maria made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation, but aligned perfectly with everything she believed about her responsibility as a nurse. She stood up from behind the equipment cart, making herself visible to draw the attackers' attention away from the helpless civilians. "Please," she called out in her soft voice, which somehow carried across the noise and chaos. "These people are just families looking for their children. They're not a threat to you." Her hands were raised, and she slowly stepped away from any cover, positioning herself between the gunman and the group of families. The gunman turned toward Maria, his weapon trained on her small frame. For a moment, the emergency department fell into an eerie silence as everyone realized what was happening. This quiet nurse, who had spent years being overlooked and ignored, was now standing alone between armed killers and innocent people. "You don't need to hurt anyone here," Maria continued, her voice remaining calm despite the weapon pointed at her chest. "Everyone here is just trying to help injured people or find their family members. None of us are involved in whatever happened earlier tonight." What happened next surprised everyone, including Maria herself. The gunman hesitated. Perhaps it was her diminutive size, her obvious lack of threat, or the genuine compassion in her voice, but something about Maria's presence disrupted his plan of attack. His companions looked confused by his hesitation, and in that moment of uncertainty, the dynamics of the entire situation shifted. Dr. Kim used the distraction to activate additional alarms and security protocols. James positioned himself to potentially disarm one of the other gunmen if an opportunity arose. But the most significant change was in the emergency department's atmosphere. Maria's act of courage had transformed the space from one of pure terror to one where people began thinking about protecting each other rather than just protecting themselves. "I'm a nurse," Maria continued, taking a small step forward. "My job is to take care of people who are hurt. That's all any of us want to do tonight. We've been helping kids who got shot, trying to save their lives. Please don't make us part of this violence." The gunman's two companions grew agitated by his hesitation, urging him to follow through on their plan. But Maria had created something powerful in that moment, a human connection that transcended the criminal motivations that had brought these men to the hospital. She wasn't pleading for her own life. She was advocating for everyone around her. Behind the nurse's station, David whispered urgently to another patient who had taken cover nearby. "That's my nurse. She stayed with me all night, made sure I wasn't scared." His words were overheard by several people, and the realization spread that this small woman was risking her life for people she barely knew, just as she had cared for strangers throughout her nursing career. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was actually less than 3 minutes. Police sirens could be heard approaching the hospital, and the gunmen realized that their window for escape was closing rapidly. Maria remained standing in the open, her hands still raised, her eyes focused on the lead gunman with an expression of compassion rather than fear. "You can still leave," she said quietly. "You don't have to hurt anyone here. These families have already suffered enough tonight." Her words carried the weight of someone who had spent years witnessing human suffering and healing, someone who understood that violence created only more pain and loss. The lead gunman's hand began to shake slightly as he maintained his aim at Maria. His criminal enterprise had been built on intimidation and fear, but Maria's response was unlike anything he had encountered. She wasn't cowering or begging. She was treating him like a human being who still had the capacity to make better choices. When police tactical units finally breached the emergency department, they found a scene that none of them had expected. The three gunmen had been effectively neutralized, not through violence, but through the moral courage of a nurse who had refused to allow fear to control her actions. The lead gunman had lowered his weapon, apparently unable to shoot someone who was clearly trying to protect others rather than herself. In the aftermath, as police arrested the three men and secured the hospital, Maria quietly returned to checking on patients and comforting families as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She helped Sophia color another picture while her parents were located and reunited with her. She ensured that David was safely transported to surgery. She assisted with the documentation and follow-up care that the night's events required. James later told investigators that Maria's intervention had probably prevented multiple deaths. Those men came here to kill people, he explained. But somehow, she convinced them that there were better choices to make. I've never seen anything like it. Dr. Kim recommended Maria for the hospital's highest honor for life-saving actions. She didn't just save lives through medical intervention. Dr. Kim wrote in her recommendation. She saved lives by demonstrating the kind of courage and compassion that reminded everyone in that room, including the attackers, of our shared humanity. The story of Maria's actions spread throughout the hospital and then to the broader community. Local news outlets picked up the story, and Maria found herself receiving recognition that felt uncomfortable and overwhelming. She had acted according to her nursing principles and her personal values, not seeking attention or praise. When reporters asked her to explain her actions, Maria struggled to find words. "I just did what felt right," she said simply. Those families had already been through so much. I couldn't stand by and watch them get hurt more. She deflected questions about her heroism, insisting that many other staff members had also acted courageously that night. The three gunmen were eventually charged with multiple felonies including attempted murder, assault with deadly weapons, and domestic terrorism. During the trial, several witnesses testified about Maria's intervention and its impact on preventing additional violence. The lead gunman, when asked about why he had hesitated, said simply, "She made me remember that there were innocent people there who didn't deserve to get hurt." Maria's actions changed more than just the outcome of that night's crisis. The hospital administration finally recognized the exceptional nurse who had been working among them for years without fanfare. She was promoted to a position where she could train other nurses in crisis intervention and patient advocacy. Her quiet leadership style, which had been overlooked for so long, became a model for other healthcare workers. The families who were in the emergency department that night never forgot Maria's courage. Several of them attended the ceremony where she received the state's highest civilian honor for heroism. Mrs. Rodriguez, Sophia's mother, spoke at the ceremony. "She didn't just save my daughter's life by treating her wound. She saved all of our lives by standing up to those men when she could have hidden like everyone else." Maria continued working at St. Mary's Regional Medical Center, though her schedule shifted to include training responsibilities and community outreach programs. She developed protocols for healthcare workers dealing with violence and trauma, always emphasizing the importance of seeing the humanity in everyone, even in the most difficult circumstances. The community center where the original shooting occurred was rebuilt with improved security and conflict resolution programs. Maria volunteered her time to teach first aid classes there, believing that empowering people with basic medical knowledge could prevent tragedies and save lives. She never spoke publicly about the details of that October night, preferring to focus on the positive changes that emerged from such a traumatic event. Years later, David, the 17-year-old who had been shot at the community center, graduated from nursing school. During his graduation speech, he mentioned the nurse who had stayed with him during the darkest night of his life. "She showed me that nursing isn't just about medical procedures," he said. "It's about being willing to protect and care for people, even when that means putting yourself at risk." Maria Santos had spent her entire career being overlooked, But in the moment when it mattered most, she proved that true heroism doesn't need recognition to be real. Her actions reminded everyone that sometimes the most extraordinary courage comes from the most ordinary people, and that the principles that guide us in our daily work can also guide us through the most extraordinary circumstances life might present.